Okay, so I think everyone's consent, so we can start the round. Debating on the motion, this House prefers a world where the majority of individuals live with their extended family instead of only with their nuclear family, calling this House to order. Prime Minister here.
Amazing. You guys hear me okay?
Yep,
Well, I don't normally do this kind of thing, but I think it's probably worth giving a bit of a content warning for this round. I'm going to talk in the case a little bit about domestic violence and a lot of like intimate sort of abuse and situations. Is anybody super uncomfortable with that kind of discussion? Okay. Uh, it seems like we're all cool. I'll go ahead and start. So the nuclear family is actually a relatively new invention. Throughout most of society, the vast majority of it, people lived in very close relationships with their parents throughout their entire lives. A lot of people were involved in the raising of children. It's only recently that this conception has evolved that you should move out of your parents' house, go sort of chart your own path, largely due to people moving through urbanization to try and reach jobs in other kinds of cities and other kinds of places, and sort of the Western conception that owning a house is a sort of status symbol. We think then that the way this round manifests is the way in which lots of Indian and other sort of Asian communities often do maintain strong family units under the sort of status quo, and the way most people used to until this relatively recent shift in the dynamics of family unions. So I have a friend back in Vancouver who lives, he's in his 30s. He lives in a house with his brother, with his brother's kids, with his parents, and they sort of all live in this one very large house that has different rooms that offer a little bit of privacy. And I imagine this is probably the way this manifests, just realistically. So people live in much larger houses than the kinds in which they can individually afford now because of the sort of saved intergeneral wealth of family units. You probably get some degree of privacy. And I think due to consumerism and capitalism, which are exogenous to the debate, there's probably reasons people are still somewhat individualistic on either side. But the point is that you just live in a larger house with more of your family members, and you don't all move off and split away the fact, I don't have a very close relationship with any of my cousins or this sort of thing. I would probably be still living with them on our side of the house. The first argument I want to talk about is on the degree to which domestic violence can often thrive in small family environments and why we think it's much harder for it to do so on our side of the debate. So, abusers thrive in situations where there's no checks and balances against their behavior, right? There's nobody to see their victims' bruises. There's nobody to hear the shouting of them at their partner. There's nobody to check against the gaslighting that makes their kids or that makes their spouse feel questionable about what really happened and what sort of way their partner treats them. When you have more people in the house, more people in the relationship, you can get more opinions and more sort of other people checking on this kind of behavior, right? More people checking up with the kid, more people talking with the spouse about their relationship problems and about the treatment of their person. And no doubt there's going to be some dysfunctional family environments on our side of the debate. I think that's fairly obvious. But the reason I think this is significantly better in our world is for two reasons. The first is the nature of power imbalances on both sides of the debate. Right? The worst kinds of domestic violence happen in instances where one party controls the entire household income, right? The man earns the money and the wife has absolutely no economic sort of viability, or you have one single parent and one child, or one abuser and nobody to check against them. In an environment where there's more people, the worst excesses of this kind of thing would be pushed back on. I don't think any grandparents want to see their grandkids sexually abused by their child. I don't think the vast majority of people are okay seeing spouses be physically assaulted to the point of nearly dying. So I think if you just imagine the way these kinds of households work, having these different kinds of adults in the situation and having more people total dramatically reduces the worst case scenarios of abuse in how long they can last and how long they can, whether or not they can start or sort of instigate and then expand and become worse over time. Like most abuse starts small and gets worse. You cut it off early, you intervene early before it gets extremely bad, before the worst sort of types of things. I'm not going to bother describing you, but that's a terminal impact of this case. I think we prove a significant margin on this. I'll take opening before moving on. What's up, opening?
Why is it likely that domestic abusers are likely to enter into these families, given that the topic states that the majority of families are going to act like this, but you haven't defined what the narrative looks like, nor why it's appealing towards these sets of individuals?
The narrative is the vast majority of sort of social norms before things changed. So we're saying we don't think that it should have changed. We'd prefer it remained the norm to live with other people in the future. I think obviously some people are not going to. Some people will choose nuclear families or whatever on our side of the debate, but most won't. And some of those people are in dysfunctional relationships that would have turned incredibly abusive, or are just horrible people who would beat their children, right? And then they don't end up beating their children because other people in the household intervene, or they don't beat them as much, right? It's much better. It's all comparative, right? I think it was pretty obvious what I was talking about there. Secondly, completely different contention. I think elderly people are genuinely one of the most under-discussed minority groups in the entire world. They're often treated quite cruelly and bitterly by other people. They have, in many instances, lowered mental capacities to stand up for themselves, lower physical capacities. The rate of abuse, the rate of sexual abuse, the rate of physical abuse towards elders is comparable to that of children. But people often don't talk about or care about this. And one of the big reasons that elders often wind up so victimized in a lot of North America and Western nuclear family societies is because we abandon our parents when we move out of our households. We lock them away in care facilities, ironically named, that often like get their food from the same places prison source their food, that they're taken care of by a bunch of people who have no relationship through them, in systems where you're rotating over a lot of the kinds of people in these facilities because they die so rapidly, and then you bring new people in. This kind of environment where you're shuffling over patients like it's a hospice center is a horrible environment for people to spend the twilight years of their lives. Like it's actually extremely sad. Sorry, I'm sort of working myself up a little bit, but the point is, older people live dramatically longer when they have a close relationship and they're actively involved in raising their grandkids. They often like live for like 10 years longer. Simply because of that human, social, intimate connection that they can be provided on our side of the debate, right? When they're in the household, they're seeing the kid laugh and smile every single day. They're reading them books. They're putting them to bed at night. That is life-changing for a huge number of people who otherwise spend the twilight years of their life with dementia, not being cared for, or falling down and nobody coming to their room for like 10 hours or something. I mean, truly horrible stuff. I think we dramatically improve those people's lives. Incredibly proud to propose.
Can I be heard loud and clear?
Yep.
First, a rebuttal. Second, an argument explaining what its narrative is coercive. Third, an argument explaining what the harms of a combined family are. Fourth, it's defending the nuclear family setup. First, a rebuttal. Two key claims we hear from opening up government. The first claim is that domestic violence improves under their side. First, they concede themselves that the sets of individuals who do domestic violence are unlikely to opt into it in all instances. The reason this is important is this mitigates the scale of benefit they're trying to claim. And then you all weigh our second response, which is that if it is true that society believes that these families co-opt and prevent domestic violence to some extent, the degree of domestic violence funding and support given by the government and government institutions drastically decreases. Because when there is not a traumatic problem, people do not act upon it. The problem then is that there's less support and less funding for the sets of people that opening government concedes exist, who still suffer from these problems. And that means on net, yes, maybe less people are suffering, but those people don't even have a way out. It undoes the decades of domestic violence reform that have happened. Second, they make an argument regarding the elderly people and say they're under discussed. First, we're going to explain in our argument why this creates unnecessary burden on parents and why this means that parents actually do a bad job at not only raising their own children, but also looking after their parents at their own time. A lost-lost situation. But second, we're going to explain here the same idea, which is that aged care is already an underfunded industry in most states and is funded by the government, not by private sectors, because it is so unprofitable to run aged care. The problem then is that because there is less demand within that sector, because people stay at home with their parents, the problem then is that there are less quality aged care services for the sets of elderly people who don't even have access to the first place. This is incredibly harmful. Three arguments. First, why is this narrative coercive? Our POI talks about the narrative because the opening government cannot just assume that this narrative is told well. We're going to explain how this narrative is told, who tells it, and why it's done in such a bad way, and why it results in a lot of their benefits not being activated. First, who is this narrative actually told by? We think this narrative is likely spread by media, but we think it's most likely to be told by members within your own family. It looks like older people telling you, hey, there's an expectation for you to look after us when you get old, in the same way that Asian and Indian families already do this in Karen as opening government concedes in their self. The problem here then is fourfold. The first is parents have a selfish incentive to actually pressure their own children into taking them even in instances where it isn't good. And not only does this extend to parents, it exists to aunts and uncles, where it becomes extraordinarily difficult and hard for individuals to actually deny this and to deny the pressure of their parents because the second reason is this already then co-opts and is in parallel with a series of other norms in society, which suggests that you actually are in the moral position to look after your parents. Like, there is a moral norm that you shouldn't just neglect your parents. And yes, it's true that people don't necessarily look after their parents, but there's a moral norm to at least visit your parents every now and then and go to their parents' birthdays. Imagine this norm paralleled with that one. Imagine how coercive that pressure is for sets of individuals who are forced to make a decision that they cannot possibly afford or want to do. The third reason why it's incredibly difficult and why this narrative is incredibly coercive, however, is because of the fact that this pressure is coming from, as they say again, your parents and your family. And no, at the point when even one person in your family gets into your family, that is a point of pressure for accept other people, because the question then is, if you have accepted your uncle, why haven't you accepted your aunt? Why haven't you accepted your, I don't know, your great-grandfather or something? And that's really harmful because it forces people to select individuals. The final reason, however, is that's coercive in the worst households, because what we explained, it is true that not all parents are coercive, but it's coercive in the households where people actually need to escape. It's coercive in extremely religious families where these beliefs would be adopted, because family being connected is a huge part of certain religions, but those are religions which push extraordinarily conservative and restricting views on sets of individuals. So individuals are not able to escape this, even if you don't believe all sets of narratives and all formulations of this narrative are bad, which is a contention GovBench will likely give. You ought credit at least this last claim in conjunction with the previous one, because it explains that there are a set of parents who have the worst set of incentives, who use this as a mechanism for their own leverage, and this is so incredibly harmful because individuals are forced to accept things when they cannot possibly do when they cannot possibly afford to. This is important for three reasons in this debate, and ought to be a debate-winning contribution for opening opposition. First, it explains the most likely mechanism that this narrative is told, because opening government operates on the presumption that this narrative is told in a good way, and individuals are actually able to make an effective choice. But individuals cannot make an effective choice. They have to explain why they are able to overcome the pressure of their parents and their extended family in conjunction with the society norm that media is espousing on them. It's so incredibly difficult for opening government or closing government to do that. But the second reason this is really important is because it explains that even if there are a set of nuclear families who are advantaged by it, the set who are disadvantaged are disproportionately disadvantaged, as I'm going to explain now. What are the harms of combined family? First, I'm going to preempt any claim from government bench that this is financially utile for individuals by explaining why it simply is not. Look at the info slide. It says grandparents, it says uncles, it says aunts, it says a bunch of other things. Actually, it didn't say there's uncles and aunts, but it did list multiple family members. What is the problem with this? You need 2 extra bedrooms at least for just the 2 sets of examples on the info slide. You need a bigger house, you need more bathrooms, you need more cars. Think about simply the cost of that. That is a huge financial cost in terms of real estate, and the biggest cost of living crisis that we have seen right now, where real estate prices are unaffordable for the vast majority of individuals. Even if there are more people who are able to combine their money to buy, that is still a huge jump that they have to make, and that's incredibly harmful. The second reason why this is so difficult, though, is even if you believe that they have marginally more money on their side, we explain that it's just so much more difficult to look after everyone, because yes, maybe your parents initially can look after your children, but your parents get old, as opening government concedes. How do you balance raising your children, looking after your parents at the same time, and working a full-time job? Obviously, this is not feasible for individuals. Closing, what's your extension? Opening?
Yeah. On this finance stuff, do you know what an economy of scale is?
I do know what an economy of scale is, but our point is cost of living plus the second pressure that we've explained. Because when you have to look after both your parents and your kids, you can't work. Like, you literally cannot, otherwise you are neglecting them when your parents are too old to walk around, which is the case that you are defending. And like the case where parents asked for this to be implemented in the first place, like, yes, maybe you guys can say there are 10 years where your parents can look after your children, but what about the remaining 20 years, right? You still need to look after your children when they're in high school, but your parents are now in wheelchairs or getting care. That's so difficult. The third thing that we explain, however, is that parents simply espouse problematic views upon their children because parents just have conservative views. And if you know our earlier weighing, which is that particularly conservative families are very effective at pushing this narrative, what this explains is that children are raised with these problematic and conservative views, which means that they might not fit in, or worse, they might just have views which are not necessarily utile or up to date in that society. So that's obviously a harm. Finally, we think it actually means abusive households can happen because there are sets of households which actually, like, for example, the oppression of women in Muslim houses, in some Muslim houses, unfortunately remains a thing. We think that this continues without intervention from outside. Furthermore, you don't have freedom. You can't get a job elsewhere. You can't escape from previous trauma. I think ultimately, opening government needs to do more than just explain that there are sets of individuals who are harmed. They have to engage with how this narrative is actually told in real life. The fact that parents are not perfect, that grandparents are selfish, that is the world we must deal with.
All right, thank you so much. Calling on Deputy Prime Minister here.
はい、is this loud enough?
Yep.
Okay. There are a lot of merits to circumventing what was honestly a pretty recent trend of isolation. Paired with this spike of Western economic freedom and individualism deriving from an American dream, the nuclear family is frankly a pretty messed up vision of what freedom is supposed to be. So the so-called idea from uh-oh that you should be free from the types of religious boundaries or the types of expectations your grandparents have for the family, this isn't freedom. This is abandoning your family for the sake of living on your own preferences. And sure, I agree that to some extent your family shouldn't be able to encroach on your personal values and that your beliefs should be upheld. But this debate is a simple comparison game, where on one side you leave your grandparents to die, and on the other side you have to make some concessions and maybe go to church on Sundays. And sure, they can argue this is, I don't know, strawmanning their case because there's like worst case types of situations with religion as well. I'll compare this later down the line and talk about why they're not going to happen. I have both ref and weighing. So first, then, I'm going to rebuild our case. Uh-oh says people who do domestic violence will just continue to be in these nuclear families because for some reason this motion has absolutely no delta about the types of families that people enter. First off, domestic violence is developed within the family, right? You don't just all of a sudden become an abusive person. You don't just all of a sudden have tendencies that are unsolvable. These are pent up ideas that are built up over time, especially in situations where there's very little surveillance over what people are doing. So once you lived with your family, with an extended family that always continues to guide you and make sure you're doing things that they are understanding that you're doing, when there's full transparency, checks and balances to make sure you're doing good things, this probably never occurs in the first place. So people don't move into a nuclear family because they didn't desire all those different tendencies or whatever benefits they decided to have by hiding in the nuclear family. But also just gut check, this argument's very, very stupid. The idea is the people who are bad people are going to leave their family, go be in a nuclear family, and then in that nuclear family, they're going to go like, I don't know, do very, very illegal things and get caught by police. Presumably, them leaving the family and having these tendencies in and of itself after being part of a community for so long is already enough of a red flag to say they will be caught doing these things. So we get better accountability metrics anyway. If anything, leaving the family and having freedom to do your own things and the marginal quantity of cases where people will still be in nuclear families will actually be used to deal with their egregious cases where the parents are the ones doing the crazy things of the religious things. I'm getting ahead of myself though. I have another response. Second response response is just to say, well, we should allow more abusive families to exist because at least this means we're going to have better services to deal with abusive families. What the fuck? No, I think that services to deal with abusive families are at the very best symmetric on both sides. They're police services, they're surveillance services that come from the fucking government. They don't change depending on how many abusive families there are. But like allowing more abusive families to exist just is this is an argument that isn't even worthy of being in debate land. Next, the response to aged care is kind of the same line. They just say, well, we want to put more people in care facilities because this creates better demand for better care facilities. But you know what? The parents who cheap out and can't afford those better care facilities will put them in less better care facilities. And those are the care facilities that Diggory very emotionally told you are horrible, are torturous for the people in the twilight years of their life. This is an awful thing. You cannot possibly support this. But even for the people who go to better care facilities, these are not facilities that you're able to link up with your family. You're still isolated from, even if you have huge chances to make friends with people there, this is contingent on your experiences there. As a parent, you probably didn't want to separate from your child permanently after they were able to become financially free from you. This makes absolutely no sense. Then OO says it's difficult to look after everyone. Diggory very reasonably POIs, well, there are economies of scale that make things very accessible for you, which is to say, this is probably a clash that Gov is winning in the end of the day, right? You don't need multiple living rooms across like 3 different families. You don't need multiple kitchens. You probably don't need you can bulk buy your groceries. You just need one big car or something. There's a lot of opportunities to save money here, which is to say, like, even if you're housing more people and people you otherwise wouldn't have taken care of, then you can still afford to take care of these people because you're saving a significant amount of money. But also, let's compare. If you don't take care of them, you're sending them to a care home to like fucking die. Like, what is this comparative? You're not weighing whatsoever. That's just not the way you should be doing debate. And I think that this is also an independent constructive that can be weighed into the round. Living is way less expensive. Housing is cheaper. The fact that housing becomes a non-issue for people who grow old, like once you become the age of 30, it is still acceptable for you to continue living in the same house. The pressure that is dealt onto children to continue to have to go into the housing market and somehow struggle to find the tiniest little apartment in New York City isn't going to happen anymore. This is another impact we can weigh. Next, we say children get way more role models and attention on our side of the house. This is just independently good. It is very true that oftentimes parents aren't going to do the best job at raising their children just because there are certain people who are more compatible with each other and certain people who are naturally born teachers. Which is to say, if you have one parent in a household who is very, very good at doing these types of things in a community-based household, everybody in the household gets these types of benefits. This is independently good. Okay, now let's talk about ops religion stuff. I think this falls to pretty simple framing. This motion mostly happens in a developed Western country because that's where there's a trade-off. In a lot of other parts of the world, community-based housing is literally the status quo. So this is about places where there currently is nuclear family, and given that nuclear families came about because of financial freedom, this tends to be in relatively wealthy areas. You know what else happens in wealthy areas? You have less children. Family sizes have just literally shrunk overall. So ops so-called very, very long hierarchies that cause like the grandparents to kind of be at like the pinnacle position, to kind of be on a throne and dictate the next like chapter of your dynasty. That doesn't happen because their army of people is reduced to like the 1 or 2 children they had and the 1 or 2 children they had. So you get bigger families, big enough to access our impacts, but not big enough for these grandparents to get oppressive power where your entire community goes against you just because of some fundamental beliefs you had. This case doesn't work whatsoever. But I think that even if this case does work, we can just simply weigh. As I mentioned earlier, this motion only forces us to defend a majority of people living within these situations. If your situation is truly so bad, I think it is possible for people to leave the situation. It is possible for people to then start nuclear families from there, and that's probably the most likely scenario for why nuclear families even started anyway. And these families can eventually blossom into community-based families. I don't really care about where those impacts are going to end up going. But even the worst cases of religion don't outweigh the types of oppression that are experienced by like children and elderly people. One is because we're just greater on scope. Abuse and like torture towards like elderly people happens to a significantly greater extent than just the same degree of harms caused onto people just based on beliefs. Because while you can have tension within your beliefs and it can make you dislike the types of settings you're in, these aren't types of tensions that can literally ruin your life, that can literally get you injured, go to school with bruises on your back, or make you die early because you've died of loneliness. I think that these are significantly lesser harms that should be weighed as such. We're beating opening opposition in like 15 different ways. They don't care about children nor old people. They cannot be allowed in this debate. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Calling on Dialog here.
First, I'm going to explain the importance of the argument which receives no response at Deputy Prime Minister about why the narrative being coercive is harmful. Because yes, they respond to the religious part of the argument, but they ignore the previous 3 reasons we give and the weighing we give to explain why in general circumstances it's incredibly harmful. Because the explanation we give, and you can check in notes for this, is that simply there are sets of individuals who cannot afford to do this or who are simply not in the circumstance to do this, who end up doing it because of this pressure. And this doesn't mean necessarily that, that they will end up, for example, abandoning their parents, but it means that their life struggles increase hugely. It means that, for example, their ability to attain financial freedom is hugely decreased, not only because they now have to bear the mortgage of a larger home, but they have to look after people who they didn't realize would take up so much time of their energy. This was a really important contribution for opening government to ignore, because not only does it unlock that harm, but it explains why in general there are sets of individuals who make this choice badly, which isn't to suggest that none of opening government's harm's benefits are ever not unlocked, will be charitable, but it's to suggest that there actually is a huge short-term trade-off that's not as smooth and as easy as this opening government suggests. Now that we've explained the importance of that not only in religious context, but in external context, let's move on to elderly people. What does they claim regarding elderly people? They say 2 things about our case. First, we haven't been comparative about elderly people, except we have been comparative in a variety of ways. How have we actually been comparative? The first thing that we explain is that care for elderly people actually gets worse, because on their side, you send them to a dedicated aged care home, which yes, may have questionable quality, but the comparative is they are locked into supporting their children because the children couldn't afford a 4-bedroom house, so they had to contribute to the mortgage as well, so they stay there, but they don't have financial freedom to go anywhere else, and their children don't have time to look after it because they're paying off for a 4-bedroom house. Like, that was the comparative we were explaining at a leader, because we were explaining that not only do you have less financial freedom for both the children and the elderly, you have less time to look after each other, because particularly as you age, you end up doing it. And the problem here that's particularly problematic is that means you have no escape on their side, because on their side, when your parents are still paying for your mortgage, how can you effectively expect them to actually do that? That is the way these Asian family and Indian family cooperatives work. The parents will actively chip into the mortgage because there is a cost of living crisis. You have to be like a quant trader at Optiva to be actually making the money to buy a house when you're 25. Your parents, of course, have to chip in, and that is so incredibly problematic for the financial freedom of your parents. But the second thing is, I just think this entire debate is so uncharitable about aged care. Because yes, aged care is not perfect. Aged care is not the excellent solution which we wish it would be, but it is not as diabolical as this side of firmly suggests for a series of reasons. Number one, aged care has been a huge part of commissions and reforms all across the world in previous years because people care about their grandparents. It's a huge form of political lobbying for people to at least say, hey, should we introduce more regulation? Should we stop more violence? This doesn't explain it's perfect, but it doesn't explain it's as bad as the opening government team suggests. Let's weigh the claims then. Opening government relies upon a world where parents live with their children. Their children don't have the time to look after them when they're old because they're still looking after their own children and them at the same time and trying to make money. But furthermore, they're locked out of any financial freedom themselves. All the money they've spent has been gone into a house which isn't even their own because of the fact that they have to buy a large house to unlock the economies of scale this opening government suggests. But second, they lock themselves out of any other form. Aged care houses aren't perfect, but this isn't the win for side opening government that they think it is. Domestic violence then. What is their claim on domestic violence? They make the fair observation that domestic violence might get better under their side. Except, I think they ignore a variety of reasons why it doesn't actually end up being to the extent it is. Number one, yes, it's true in the worst instances. If you're punching someone, if someone has bruises, that'll be reported. But what about things like emotional abuse? Particularly because older people are a little bit more conservative about their views about relationships, which means that, for example, a shouting match which is consistent might just be told to, arguments happen in your life. They tend to happen. That is the way that a lot of conservative and families tend to look at this. And yes, maybe not all families look at it this way, but this explains that there are a set of families who actually do not resolve this in the way that it should be, and it still results in abuse. But second, they strawman our claim. Our claim was that you have simply less funding and support because there's a huge amount of crime that exists in any state at one point. You allocate crime based on how much of it occurs, and it is the unfortunate reality, as it's been for the past 30 years, that when domestic violence is not reported or domestic violence violence is not the forefront. There's simply less funding for it. We're not saying that more domestic violence is good. Of course we're not saying that. We're saying that unfortunately society has a finite amount of money, which means that they have to allocate money elsewhere if they feel like there already is a solution, and that makes it so much worse for pre-existing victims. But it's incredibly hard to leave these relationships on their side, because if one person leaves the family or there's a divorce, that breaks up the entire family setup, right? Like if the mother leaves, suddenly their mother's grandparents don't know what to do. The father's grandparents don't know what to do. And it creates a huge amount of chaos, which explains why it's an incentive of families to try and keep it together and to actually keep domestic abuse, maybe not reported. They might try and bottle it up or try and search it internally, which only makes it worse. All this explains is domestic violence is not the clear win for this opening government that they think it is. Neither are elderly people. Their final claim is on children. And they say here that children get more attention on their side from a greater set of people, and this is really useful. Two problems with this argument. First, we explained that they get less time. We explained very clearly, because they misconstrue our economies of scale response. They were referring to money. We were referring to time. We were saying parents have a finite amount of time to look after their grandparents and their children. And grandparents simply just can't do a lot of things with children which they want to. Like they're old. They have to look after their own healthcare needs. So yes, maybe initially there's more attention. But second, we're going to explain why the familial connection with your parents is particularly important. We're going to explain it's important because number one, if you have a close connection with your parents in particular, that is a confidence which you often might not have. Whereas it's more difficult to form these relationships with older people. But second, it's difficult to form relationships, meaningful relationships on their side with anyone because there are too many people to form relations with. You have to form relations with the older people, the younger people. There's no stability in your household. It makes it incredibly difficult. At the end of opening half, then, what should you believe? Elderly people is worse because you lock them out of financial freedom on their side. They might claim a small win on domestic violence, but they never explain, but we are also able to not only claim on children, but we explain very concretely a win on the narrative. And here, I'm going to explain just again how important this claim is, because this narrative means that parents simply don't have the resources. That is a prerequisite to unlocking the claims that opening government wants. They don't have the actual consideration. They make rush decisions, or they make decisions that are not within their own interest. And this is hugely problematic because it unlocks all the economic harms that we suggest. It means that you enter without enough money. It means your parents are locked into the mortgage. It means you aren't able to pursue a career. It means you aren't able to escape traumatic relationships. They say the Western world, it doesn't have that much conservative views. Or like, you can't assume this is just the Western world because it says nuclear families in the title and you keep referring to the US. Like, obviously the nuclear family is a concept which has transcended into many countries. I'm so proud to oppose.
All right, column number.
All right, can I verify that people can hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. PYs in the chat, please. I will take a PY around 5, preferably from opening. If opening does not have one, then closing. Is anybody not ready? Cool. Look, there are only two certainties in life, death and taxes. On CG, we want to talk about the economy. Our core claim is that the amount of space needed to live comfortably does not scale linearly when you add more people to a family unit. This means that larger family units cause much more efficient housing. This is awesome. It's going to outweigh opening. Even if opening was emotionally persuasive, in the end, the economy matters more. Before I get to this properly, though, one note. I think that OO does a very intelligent push, which is, look, when you have nuclear families, you can self-select. Maybe you will choose to do a multi-generational home if it makes sense. And I think that OG is really dismissive and doesn't beat this argument. We're going to tell you why the narrative in particular is necessary and why self-selection isn't enough. This is because in order to buy housing, a developer has to make the housing. Developers are private corporations that are profit maximizing. This means they can sell more units that are more expensive. They're going to do so, which they get the most by selling single-family housing. This necessarily means that insofar as single-family housing makes them more money, they only produce it, so you never get the choice to live in multifamily housing in the first place, unless you're trying to buy a mansion or something, which you can never afford. That means the narrative necessary to get multi-generational family housing built, because one, the developers have to believe people will buy it, and two, there's be cultural pressure, because on net, we're going to argue it's less profitable. This is why the narrative is necessary, and because we need to coerce the developers. Maybe we'll coerce some individuals too, but I care more about the developers. Now, let's talk about why housing is more efficient. 3 mechanisms. First, you get the reuse space. This is a very simple argument. When you add an additional portion of the house, you have to add a new bedroom, and every couple of people you add a bathroom. You never have to add a new kitchen. You never have to add a new common room. It does not scale linearly. You only need one kitchen. right, necessarily means that when you add more people to a family house, it means you aren't adding a new air conditioning unit. A lot of these things can work for, say, 5, 6, 7 people, but in the status quo, we're using them for at most 3 people. So when you add more people, you are substantially adding less over time. Additionally, you intend to build up, not out, so using less land. Second, you eliminate wasteful housing. There's a lot of ways we live now that are just really dog shit uses of space. 2 really good examples are single-person apartments. You have your own private kitchen and bathroom, and they might be small, but to be frank, you could have shared that same kitchen and bathroom with 3 other people, and it would have been fine. Instead, you live in your own apartment. Yeah, it might be a small New York apartment. Realistically, it's not. Most people don't live in New York. Most people aren't debaters. But even if it is, you could have split more people in there by just adding more bedrooms. But more importantly, you end up with old people in big empty houses. They usually own them because maybe they were an incumbent and bought housing when it was cheaper, or because they saved up money and they built a big house because they felt like they needed it, or maybe their spouse died, and now you have a house that you could fit 7 or 8 people, and you have 1 old person in it, which is quite bad. Third, we reduce pressure on megacities. Young people want to live in megacities because they're cool and hip, and maybe there's some more jobs there, but parents realistically didn't. They usually lived in tier 2 cities. The problem is that megacities have limited land simply by the fact you want to live near the urban core, but also they tend to be port cities, which is why they got big in the first place. So on peninsulas or islands, we have a limited ability to expand. We have limited land, which means that prices go up because too many people want to live in there. But when you live with your family, you're more likely to live where your parents or grandparents live, and you stay in tier 2 cities, which is good. Because even though these cities aren't flash and all the media attention, they still have all the same economies of scales and amenities that big cities have, which means you get lower prices, but you get the same shit, other than being able to feel like you're cool because you say, I live in New York. Now, all of this has 3 main benefits. The first main benefit is this goes a long way to solve the housing crisis. This directly flips Owen's argument about housing is getting more expensive. 1, we reduce the demand for housing by using housing more efficiently. 2, we increase the supply by using land more efficiently. This means you get way lower prices. This also means that as population goes up, there's less expectation that people will buy new houses because you know they'll live in the same houses as their parents. It means there's less speculation, so because it looks like housing prices will increase less over time, so you don't get speculatory bubbles. This means that prices for housing stays a lot more reasonable. This has numerous benefits. First, it frees up capital in families. Because families have more money they can spend, say, investing in getting kids going to college, getting them like ballet class or whatever, buying food to put on the table, which is important for a lot of families. It massively increases quality of life, but it's not just that. It also increases consumer demand because all buying stuff, they have to buy that from businesses, so the money gets spent over and over and over. This money that's not locked out of the economy in long-term mortgages. Second, it also frees up investment capital, i.e., banks will spend like, say, 40% of their portfolio on mortgages because they seem safe, and now there's a bunch of money that's not going to businesses, where houses are cheaper, less capital is being spent on that, and more will be spent on things like businesses which directly contribute to the economy and people's quality of life. This is especially important in developing countries where often you don't have a very sophisticated capital market, you have limited capital, which often get highly locked into housing as these countries like China or India rapidly urbanize. This is a Faustian bargain because either 1, they have to accept slow growth because they have no capital and it's locked in 30-plus-year mortgages, which they can't do because they have a limited demographic window to expand when they have a large number of young people relative to old people. Or 2, they have to have high-risk bubbles by spending the same dollars that are also invested in housing. And this is how you get China or Japan. We're going to giant bubble pop, or 2008 financial crisis. We have mortgages that are thought to be safe. You invest that money again, then that goes away, then the mortgages blow up too, and suddenly your entire country explodes. You lose a decade of growth and people's savings go away. Opening.
I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding the extension, but you're proposing that families demolish apartments or houses on existing land, rebuild it to be larger? As in, I understand your impact, but what is the mechanism by which
Our
they do
argument
it?
is you use space way more efficiently. A house that would have had 2 people in your world now has 5 people in it. This means on net, we use less land. We use housing more efficiently. It's quite straightforward. Now, other argument, we reduce suburbanization, right? Nuclear families cause a massive rate, creating separate homes, all of which need more land. So you, for example, have to clear-cut areas to make room for this land. And you have to waste resources building more houses, buying dishes and pans and AC and computers for every single new house. This is really bad because those are environmental harms. For example, this looks like destroying land because you destroy the ketone species, so you destroy the ecosystem, which means other species die, and now suddenly you can't farm in the area anymore because the locusts have taken over. It also means you waste a massive amount of resources and energy. These look like metals. This looks like running high energy AC in multiple households. This looks like forcing every family member to have in a car, which pollutes the environment. These are really substantial impacts. It's easy to underrate these because the suffering often isn't human. It's animals whose entire species have gone extinct, while like literally tens of thousands of them have died for each individual human, and because the harms to humans are dispersed. I.e., when you fuck up the environment, you cause people to say get cancer and die early, but it's hard to attribute the cause. It's the same cognitive fallacy makes people way more scared of nuclear power plants because the harm is concrete than coal power plants, even though each coal power plant probably kills at least 100 people with lung cancer. Obviously, the environmental harm is dispersed, so it's really hard to quantify, but every new suburb we're building, so people have single-family homes, is literally killing a fuck ton of animals, all of whom do suffer, by the way, and giving people cancer down the line, which is really bad. Proud to
Right, thank you so much. Number 4, here.
Hello, am I audible? Am I audible? Hello?
Here.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, give me a moment to set up my timer, yeah. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, first off, before I go on anything, I would just like to thank Closing Government for the economics lecture. However, this debate isn't necessarily about being the next property guru, right? I understand this whole concept about property, this whole concept about economics of scale and financial cost. These things are very diverse, are very different. It's a very sort of niche concept depending on the state, depending on the country you live in, right? So simply because the spectrum of like the properties are so diverse, this debate can't really be about property, right? Instead, what we would like to say is that this debate is about relationships. The real purpose of the debate is about safe spaces as well as the ability or rather inability to realize your actual self, right? So I'll be summarizing the three teams' speeches. So opening opposition talks about how financial costs and economies of scale, would mean that living with a nuclear family would be better. However, we see that this is symmetric on both sides. Either you buy like a 3x3 bedroom house or a 1x9 bedroom house, doesn't really matter in terms of cost, right? So, furthermore, we see that like even if it's not symmetric, it doesn't really matter because again, this debate is about relationships, it's about safe spaces, it's about the ability to realize your actual self. Now, opening government, right? So they bring up this point about abuse. I'll rebut this in my speech, but essentially the abuse is also on their side. I'll elaborate later on, right? Then they talk about again economies of scale, right? Again, we see that finance is a non-issue in this debate, especially when compared to the real problem of the debate, which again I'll state for like the third time. Now it's about safe spaces, it's about the ability to realize your actual self, and it's about relationships. Now then, what does closing government tell you? They give you an economics lecture about how what apparently it's better for individuals to live with their extended family because of like cost. Again, like I'm just gonna tell you again that like this debate is not about property, it's about relationships, right? So on the aged care point, right, we see that the aged care point is irrelevant to whether you live with your extended family or your nuclear family, since whether you get good aged care, poor aged care, whether you even get aged care, or it's dependent on how much you care about your grandparents, right? And so whether how much these sort of parents would like to invest in their grandparents, for example, right? It's not whether you live with them or not, right? In fact, we see that it's better on our side, where you don't necessarily interact with them 24/7, i.e., you visit with them only on weekends, which is what happens in status quo, because then you tend to have a better relationship with them. I'll elaborate this in my substantive. So what is the real problem of this debate then? The real problem is that living with your extended family is bad due to the concept of home being a same space, plus you now having the inability to realize your actual self. Our stance is simple. Our stance is that simply put, in status quo, a nuclear family already has some issues present. But now when you add this sort of extended family, you sort of exacerbate these issues, right? We see that whatever potential benefit that can be realized, is not realized, right? And again, we see no necessity to interact with a lot of people with different viewpoints. If Prop's point is to become like, more mature through interaction, is to bond the family, because things like employment already exist in status quo. Furthermore, we see that like you living with your nuclear family doesn't necessarily mean that you completely abandon your grandparents or relatives. We see that you sort of can still visit them in status quo, which is like what people do. So on to my first substantive, right, which is as to why living with your extended family, the harms far outweigh whatever potential benefit that is present. Understand that the concept of home is that it should be a safe space, right? So what proposition does is they flip this into a hostile environment where you can't express your viewpoints freely at all, right? They completely infringe upon your ability for you to actualize in the way you want to, right? So when this sort of extended family knows your very personal details in sort of very close physical proximity with you, you sort of get no privacy, or you get way lesser privacy compared to when you live with your nuclear family, right? And furthermore, because of how like foreign they are to you compared to your nuclear family, you sort of get significantly worse impacts in terms of expressions, right? So then, on to sort of this sort of parent sibling, or rather over competitiveness towards siblings, right? So when you sort of force all the siblings to live together, you force them into a condition where they are sort of where they have to compete with each other, because understand that physical achievements are manifest in like physical objects, right? For example, medals, for example, trophies. So when you force the people to live together, these individuals, or rather these siblings, tend to have to look at these things on a daily basis, right? So this sort of creates a toxic place where people constantly compete to be better than the other, right? So this is specific to the extended family in terms of scale of impact, right? So in your extended family, you have sort of way more trophies, way more people living together, way more trophies, way more medals, way more physical objects. As such, you sort of have way more competition compared to the nuclear family, right? So understand that extended families also harbor a lot of different individuals, i.e. different opinions regarding certain things, certain topics, and sort of live very differently, right? So this sort of creates a social friction. And since everybody lives in different ways, in status quo and nuclear families, you already sort of have a lot of disagreements, right? And if you extend this to extended family, you have a lot of individuals with different opinions, with different backgrounds, with different sort of principles. This social friction only like is exacerbated on their side. Right. So then why will you have less attachment to your family as a whole when you live with the extended family? I already explained to you how you have less social friction on the side of on the side of proposition, because and so therefore when you have more social friction, because you are less likely to live in a place where you can't express yourself, what happens then is you have this sort of less attachment to due to how you feel unsafe around your family, due to how like you are unable to express yourself, right? You sort of nowhere else to turn to, because and now therefore like your mental health decreases because you can't trust anyone, right? And as such, you are less close to your family as a whole cause of this over competitiveness, and your own personal choice is sort of criticized to a larger amount cause, simply put, scale, right? You have more people criticizing you, and as such you have less trust to your family as a whole since you argue with them constantly. Right. So, to rebut opening government's point on abuse, right? Understand that abuse is through generational trauma, not necessarily through your nuclear families, right? So so even if you have more people present, doesn't necessarily mean that the abuse will go away. In fact, we see that it is worse on your side, because empirically speaking, if in a nuclear family, 1 in 3 people tend to be abusive people, that means that like in a extended family, like you have 30 people, for example, like this doesn't mean that like 1 in 3 people will now become like 1 in 10, 1 in 20 people. Right. And furthermore, understand that because you have more people now when you have extended family and abuse is covert, what happens then is that these bad actors will now have incentive to make abuse more covert, i.e., like for example, they can gaslight the child into not telling other people about the abuse, etc. Right. Furthermore, we understand that with your extended family, relationships are less close. So therefore, this sort of like abused child, for instance, would have less incentive to like tell other people of the abuse, and the other family members will have less chances of noticing the abuse compared to under a nuclear family, which sort of rebuts their whole point on abuse. As such, please side aside closing opposition, the side that actually protects your members and uh nuclear families. Thank you.
All right, go with me here.
Can I get your eyes in the chat, please? Closing government's case is very simple. By living with more people, each individual fundamentally needs less space and less resources. This is because the amount of communal space, kitchens, living rooms, yards, etc., doesn't need to increase in size linearly for each additional person for everyone to feel comfortable. Less demand for space means space opens up for poorer individuals to get housing near jobs in city centers. It means we don't need to clear-cut land to build sprawling suburbs. It means we can attack housing insecurity at its source by making it cheaper to live. Note here that we are the only team that provides a reason that this narrative in and of itself is key. We need a majority to do it because it forces developers to create these spaces that allow people to have easier and cheaper lives. A few pieces of rebuttal to the various things that people have said against our case. First of all, this House prefers the world motion is retroactive, which means that the developers have always enacted in this way. People have always lived in this way, which means that we are probably not tearing down any existing single-family apartment housing. In fact, it's just simply that this housing was always built as multi-generational housing. Secondly, it is in fact true that the housing crisis is quite ubiquitous. The housing crisis is being faced by every single developed and developing nation because urbanization is a constant in every stage in every country's development. Everyone wants to move into the cities, thus housing prices increase because there's a large demand for housing, but there's a finite supply. You lower that demand, you keep the same supply, there's less of a housing crisis. All right. Let's take a closing opposition first. First, they tell us that this debate is about relationships, not about the economy. They don't really give us a reason for this, it's just an assertion. But I question what is prior to relationships. I want to think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You cannot have relationships with anyone if you do not have access to shelter. Weigh these. Those who can access relationships are fundamentally privileged because they have their other needs met. There are people who are on the streets, people who are unable to eat because they are forced to live in food deserts, people who are commuting 3 hours each day to be able to get to work and still have no time for their own personal needs and hobbies. I think those people are going to be significantly more important in this round simply because the impact on their lives is more severe. They then go on to say that housing is a safe space. One, people can still get personal space in multi-generational housing. They probably have their own bedrooms. But two, you probably feel safer because you get to live with many family members, whereas the only real alternative for the vast majority of people is to probably live with a stranger as a roommate. This is very unsafe for many people, especially those at risk of violence or mental harms. The alternative is, do you want to live with 4 family members or do you want to live with 1 stranger? I would choose 4 family members for safety because you know those people. The third thing here is that families are not inherently competitive. I think this is a narrative largely brought up by the society that we live in. You'll probably still compete in their world as well. For example, being shown on social media and things like that, or just in times when you see your family on vacation. But on our side, you probably compete less because success is communal. If one person gets a promotion, for example, that helps the entire household, and also because of the fact that you just learn to share early because it's expected of you. Moving on to opening government. Opening government gives us 2 groups that will be benefited, victims of abuse and elders. We agree that these groups are important, but I want to do some weighing. First, on likelihood. Opening government does not prove, just doesn't prove likelihood of their case. Essentially, there are easy holes to pick, such as abuse by your in-laws occurring, or the fact that many people do not know how to perform elder care, and this probably results in harming their loved ones. It's really convoluted, their cases. Our case is very simple, and true in all cases, that you just physically take up less space and need less stuff, so it costs less for you to live. Secondly, on scale, our case impacts more people. We tell you that the average person spends less on housing, less on furniture, less on cooking gear, vacuums, all that kind of stuff. These individual expenses may seem small, but they add up over time because this is your entire lifetime. This is monthly expenses every single month. Note that opening opposition contests that there will be a need for more bedrooms. First, you already needed these bedrooms, so you're going to be paying the same amount. It's just the communal spaces get smaller. But secondly, they say that time is going to be a problem. But time works similarly to bedrooms, right? You need less time to care for 2 to 3 kids at once than you would have to do if each person cared for their own kid individually. These savings are especially important for those who are housing insecure, pushing some people over the line to be able to afford housing that they otherwise may be on the streets. But it also impacts people of all economic strata because everyone can use more money in a world where life is increasingly expensive, where people cannot afford to have children or take vacations. This money is spent on things like education or simply finding joy in life by having hobbies. Notably, this impacts victims of abuse and elders much more directly than opening government's case. By freeing up economic resources, you can afford better elder care, whether that's in-home care or sending them to simply better facilities that do not abuse them. You're able to escape abuse better because you might be able to afford to have a place to live because being able to live is fundamentally cheaper. Thirdly, finally, on severity, access to places with jobs break people out of cycles of poverty. That is how you break cycles of abuse, by getting to higher education, by learning what is normal to be able to be experiencing, by meeting other people, by being able to afford things like therapy, by being able to afford things like therapy. That's how you actually impact these kinds of cyclic issues that occur that open government talks about. But secondly, climate change is extremely bad. Houses are made of things like wood. This is quite bad because we are clear-cutting forests to build suburban housing. You cannot just keep building and building and building. There are impacts that impact the lives of individuals who are going to be living there. The more that you clear-cut, the more landslides you have, the more prone your homes are to flooding, the more heat waves that you have that kill individuals who have weak immune systems. This is how you end up with a world that is fundamentally changing and moving towards a climate that is fundamentally irreparable. This is how you move towards extinction via climate change. I'll take the POI.
We explain our opening opposition that this narrative is coercive. This weighs against your extension because it
Yeah, I'm
explains
about to
that
get to
people
the
will
coercive
buy
narrative
houses when they
argument.
cannot afford to do so.
Thank you. I'm getting to that when I talk about your speech, which is right now. Opening opposition. Opening opposition says that individuals will be abused and manipulated by their parents. First, on likelihood. If your parents want to manipulate you, they will do it either way. This is the reason why this problem that opening opposition points out exists in East Asia, parallel to strong narratives of needing to get your own home when you are becoming an adult, because the parents are manipulating you no matter what the reason behind their manipulation is. So this is non-unique. But secondly, if you're expected to take care of your parents, in the status quo, then they probably won't feel the need to manipulate you to get you to stay in their house. So they do things like feeling comfortable letting you go to school or getting a job in a big city because they know they have security in the future, because they know that you're going to be socially expected to take care of them, so they don't have to manipulate you and ruin your future. But secondly, on Wayne, it is very rare that families want to manipulate their children. The vast majority of parents love their children and want them to succeed because that is their legacy and because they just generally are biologically inclined to love their children, which means I think that opening opposition case impacts the smallest possible number of people out of all of the 4 cases in this round. I think we fundamentally outweigh on the fact that even if it is true that parents are going to manipulate you more in our world, I just think a larger number of people are able to break out of cyclic poverty and then in the future not want to manipulate their own kids because they aren't dealing with the type of mental trauma that comes with living in a situation of poverty. Thanks.
All right, I'll put here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Great, thank you so much. Sorry, just give me a moment to set up my timer. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want you to imagine a world in which you go back to your home, a place which is supposed to be a safe space for you, a place in which you are supposed to be able to freely express your viewpoints, a place in which you are supposed to have the full support of everyone around you, and instead of that, what you get is it's essentially just a housing space with so much animosity because of the fact that there are so many people living in your house that people aren't able to form meaningful relationships. You're just living with random people and you aren't able to legitimately actualize or express yourself. We tell you that this is the reality that exists on the side of government in today's debate, and we tell you that for that reason we win today's debate, because we at the very least defend the mental health and the ability to feel safe in your own home for individuals. Okay, before I get to my questions, I want to point out a few major strategic errors from all sides of the house except for CEO. First thing, I like to point out that O and CG really hone in way too much on this economy point. I'm going to explain why I think that this point isn't really relevant to today's debate and why exactly we can probably wash it out. First of all, we don't think that the price of property is something which is going to legitimately be a very large determining factor in today's debate, because insofar as the price of property is going to really adjust and is really going to depend specifically on the country that you live in, it's probably going to depend on what sort of property you're looking at. There's too much spectrumization here. We can't exactly talk about one being concretely more expensive than the other. But secondly, we tell you that's probably going to be largely symmetrical, right? Because there's probably very little difference between buying one single very large house for 9 people against buying 3 comparatively smaller units for 3 different people for 3 different houses. We tell that the amount of cost is probably going to be largely symmetric. But look, even if we were to assume that it's going to be slightly more expensive to live in a 9-person household, I don't understand the upshot of this. Look, if it's way too expensive for you to live in a 9-person household, then just sell it and then move to a slightly smaller 9-person household. We don't understand what the upshot of this argument is. Even if it's going to be financially more expensive for them to incur this cost, they can literally just move to a smaller house. We don't understand this entire push on the economy. We tell that this point false. But then they come up and they tell us that the cost of living is also going to be higher. Okay, I don't understand this point about cost of living, right? Because the cost of living is also symmetrical, because the financial ability to provide is the same on both sides. I.e., if there are 3 breadwinners with a monthly income of 19K providing for 20 people across 3 houses on outside of the house is on a financial level the exact same as three breadwinners with a monthly income of 19K providing for 20 people in a single house, we tell you therefore then very simply put, there's going to be symmetrical when it comes to the economy. So this entire point is a wash. Therefore, CG and O are immediately out of today's debate. But now I want to deal with the main point coming out from OG, which I believe to be the most important government point in today's debate. Before I continue, I will take one from OG.
Yeah, I think it's just a little weird the way a lot of teams have clashed in this round and just assume we ought to privilege the children of elderly people rather than them. I don't really think there's any reason to do that. So even if adult children are coerced or there's some burdens put on them, absent any reason to care about them more, I think you probably care more about elderly people because they're vulnerable.
Okay, regarding the elderly point, I will get to that later on. But okay, I want to get back to OG and what they really fundamentally claim, right? So the main fundamental unique claim that comes out from OG, which I don't think O really directly responds to, is this idea of abuse. Essentially, the idea here is just that it's going to be far easier to detect abusive relationships in larger extended families and larger families because there are more people to have checks and balances with. Two multiple things. First of all, we want to point out the fact that abuse rarely stems from just a single individual. It's likely to be generational, right? You're likely to perpetuate the specific behaviors and the specific ways in which your parents have abused you upon your children themselves. Therefore, then if you want to talk about abuse, it's probably going to be far worse because if it's going to be generational, you are in fact inviting even more people who are probably going to be problematic actors to live with you. But okay, let's continue to respond to this. Look, given the premise that these individuals are going to be abusive anyway, we argue that even in a larger house, they're probably still going to be equally abusive. They're just going to be more covert about it. The reason why they're able to do this is because of what Emo said. The very, very simple reason as to why this is so is because when you have more people within a specific house, it makes it significantly more difficult for you to form interpersonal relationships with one another, i.e. you are less likely to care about each other and you're less likely to know things about each other. So the checks and balances in place here don't necessarily work against abuse. Okay, but on top of that, let's just make this a argument of probability. If we were to assume that that these people or these bad actors or these abusive individuals are independent actors and they are independently abusive from things like generational trauma, we just want to weigh the balance of probability here. Look, on outside of the house, within 3 different people within a nuclear family, there is a 10% chance for each of them to be an abusive individual and engage in abusive activities. On your side of the house, it's still a 10% chance for each individual, but there are 30 fucking people in a single house. Therefore, then we tell you that there's a significantly higher probability on your side of the house for there to actually be an abusive actor. Therefore, we win this point of abuse and we prove to you why exactly is going to be far, far worse on government side. Okay, then let me deal with this point about elder care. I don't really understand this point about elder care. Look, both sides clearly care about the elderly, and yes, we agree, we care about the elderly, but we don't understand what the main contention of today's debate is. Look, if you do care about your parents, you're probably going to send them to really, really high quality elder care facilities on outside of the house, or you're probably going to constantly check up on them in every single situation in which you can because you inherently care about them. If you don't care about your parents, then even if you're in the same house, you're probably not going to acknowledge them at all. You're probably going to ignore them completely, and therefore this is probably going to lead to the exact same detriment anyway. But in fact, it's probably going to be worse because you have the ability to do things like physically abuse them, right? So we tell you that when it comes to elder care, it's significantly worse on their side of the house. So why do we win? We win because we specifically talk about the main crux of today's debate, how a home is supposed to be like for the individuals living in it. We tell you that when you have a far less close family household, when you take a lot of different people with different opinions on certain situations and throw them into a melting pot, what you essentially get is a home which is going to be far more difficult to live in. There's going to be far more social friction because every single individual decision you make, there could be a single relative who just doesn't like it. You therefore feel far less close to your family for every single individual in your family. So that means that when you go home from your 9 to 5 job, you just want to talk to somebody about something. You can't because your home is no longer a safe space for you to express yourself. If you want to express your gender identity, you can't because of the fact that for example, there's a very, very religious person in your family who might have a problem with it. We tell you it necessarily impedes upon the individual ability to actualize themselves. We tell you it takes away from the individual's ability to legitimately live their lives in comfort. And we tell you for all those reasons, the home is essentially going to be significantly far worse on the side of government. We are the only side that has brought this up in today's debate, and we are the only side that has legitimately talked about this. Therefore, we win. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Before we end, can I know, since you're iron personing, which speech you want to be credited? Your first or second speech? Hello. I didn't hear you. So if you talk, yeah.
First speech.
Okay, so you want your first speech to be credited, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks everybody. Since this is a silent round, I'll be giving an away. So feel free to reach out after breaks. So, thank you.
Thank you all
Thanks,
so much
everybody.
for the debate. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the debate.